Hey, thank you for joining me for part 8 of my reading of History, Fiction, or Science, Chronology 1 by A.T. Fomenko. I am going to review real quickly, but I do want to mention something before I go very far. I have noticed recently when I was going through a number of my channels and actually deleting a number of them that although they had some decent information from time to time, they just contained way too much poison in them for me to continue subscribing to them. Channels, I don't know, channels like Jeranism and Eric Dubay with the veganism and whatever. Anyways, so I noticed an inordinate amount of channels that have been shut down for one reason or another. There would either be messages on there that they violated YouTube's community guidelines, or they continually violated copyright problems, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. I was first contacted not quite a week ago from one channel that I had been subscribed to for quite some time, that went by Wake Us with the capital US from our slumber. And he told me that his channel had been taken down. And I noted it. And I had noticed another one had gone down, which it was kind of a head scratcher. But yesterday, when I was going through the channels that I had, I noticed that in addition, the other channels that were down were Curious Life, which was an excellent channel. Daniel Pratt, Reshaping Our World. Just That Guy Called Cumbism, which, for those of you who are familiar with John Cumby. Paul Sandhu, which I don't really buy into most of his theories, but I had been subscribed to him since he was saying some things that were pretty sensible. And the weirdest thing was the Richie Allen Show channel was down, and I can't understand that at all. Well, anyways, if this should continue, first off, it's my opinion that what's going to happen is that eventually there's going, and by the way, there's still plenty that are up that have been unmonetized. And so now a lot of these channels who were making a few bucks off their channel are opening Patreons and whatnot. Well, that's one of the reasons I never monetized. And I never tried too much to be all that entertaining or you know, I suppose create videos that people would want to click on, you know, a 5 or 10 minute video that kept things short and sweet and, you know, either visually appealing or, you know, whatever. Because I just didn't want any kind of conflict of interest. But at this point in time, they could just be doing this arbitrarily. And the reason that it seems like a reason that they would be doing this is it relates to a little bit an organization called American Renaissance, headed by a guy named Jared Taylor, is suing Twitter for really just unfair censorship, honestly. Because, you know, places like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook will allow so much absolute junk for man's eyes and man's mind through. But anything of substance that happens to, as they arbitrarily judge, violates whatever. And oftentimes they're extraordinarily hypocritical in what they judge to be violations. So, anyways, yeah, American Renaissance is suing Twitter because what they're trying to do is build a case that Twitter and other social media outlets like YouTube and probably Facebook, and there's a lot more that just don't have the big names that they do, are actually community utilities or public utilities. So they're going off of a case in California where somebody was like passing out literature or speaking at a shopping mall, and the shopping mall was privately owned, but the thing was, it was still a public venue for people to speak at or do those kind of things at, and that's sort of the precedent that they're trying to set with that. Now, it seems to me with as many people as they've either demonetized hypocritically, and it's blatant hypocritical demonetizing, or just channel shutdowns, that what may happen is a class action lawsuit against YouTube. And Jared Taylor's American Renaissance and their lawsuit against Twitter may become class action as well. What I worry about concerning that is that this may lead to legislation that actually makes all of this worse. And not just on YouTube and Twitter or Facebook, but all of the social media platforms, that our politicians who don't work for us and unfortunately are not fearful of us will pass the control of all of this, since all of these platforms are worldwide. They're not just specific to a country. They will want to pass the policing of this stuff, since it could be deemed a public utility, onto the UN, international bodies like that. And I would have to say it would probably just be much worse. Personally, I think I can't imagine that there aren't philanthropists out there, people who've been blessed with an inordinate amount of wealth, that couldn't build their own server farms and offer private, exclusive sites where certain peoples, I mean, I guess as they deem. I mean, if they want one for Christians, good. I mean, if they want one specifically for Muslims, okay. Or they're going to start a site and server farm where people are mostly concentrating on whatever, I guess, Atlantean theories, and not to necessarily, put anything down, although I truly don't believe those things, but either way, I think that it's going to have to be taken out of the hands of these obviously hypocritical, lying, no goodness in them kind of people and organizations, and be more privatized. It's just the most horrible thing for people who claim to be good to give in to this kind of thing without a fight, without saying, well, yeah, you can do your thing. If you want to be hypocrites and liars and inconsistent, and you want to bully people and nitpick and do anything whatever way you want to do, not staying within your own guidelines, okay, that's fine, but we're going to move somewhere else and we're going to do our own thing. You have at it. Now, if it should happen that the same thing should happen to my channel, I don't know exactly where I'll go, but if I do, I would say look for me under the title of Lingua Veritas. which is probably the title for a lot of the projects I'm doing, that it will probably go by. And I'm sure I'll continue using my name in some way, either as Jonathan or John Mactemus. So this is just kind of a preempt to see if this happens, because, as I said, a lot of those shutdowns are seemingly very arbitrary. And the channels that I've noticed that they've left alone, if they were really sticking to a solid set of rules instead of just doing whatever they want, there would be other channels that would be suffering instead of the channels that I've mentioned. And there's far more than that, and I'm sure plenty of you are aware of. So I just need to bring that to your attention. The other thing is, I want to encourage anyone who's not familiar with two channels to take a look at them. One is called Ancient Architects, and they just did a video that's really interesting. It's entitled 7,000-Year-Old Europeans in Florida, North America. And they've done older videos, actually, on Doggerland and other really interesting stuff. The other one is not a big channel. It's a very small channel. It actually only has like 2 videos that this guy has produced. Both of them fantastic videos. I believe this gentleman is Russian, but that I think he has a digital translator. But he talks about the problems with what we've been told are ancient temples and statues that seem to be ubiquitous. And he talks about types of concreting, various forms of rock, a number of other specialists in rock and ancient megaliths and stones have talked extensively about this. Even Wise Up channel, he talks a lot about what he believes are remnants of what were concrete structures. Really interesting channel too. Wise Up is right here, and I do watch Wise Up a lot as well. So these are good channels. If you're not familiar with them already, please check them out. Now today I'm getting started late, which really stinks. I slept in, I guess, but I was very excited to get to these sections in front of me. By way of very quick review, what Fomenko had gone over in the last sections that I had read was, for one thing, sort of out of place. I don't know if you want to say artifacts, out of place drawings. That if they're dating it correctly and the chronology and history they tell us is also correct, then there's a huge problem. You know, it looks like we've got knights in full armor way earlier than we're supposed to. We have strange objects that nobody can necessarily really account for. It seems that nobody can conclusively date the destruction of Pompeii by Vesuvius. It would seem that we have characters of antiquity from the classical age entirely overlapping characters of the Renaissance age and ages in between. We have all kinds of characteristics from the classical age overlapping the Renaissance age. So much so that it should be not only commented on, but digged into far harder, based on the amount of evidence that not only Fomenko, but the cadre of historians who at least believe there's 300 years added, they've pointed these things out as well. So there's plenty of evidence out there to suggest that we've got a serious problem with historical overlaps, patterns. And this is the one thing that apparently Fomenko is going to concentrate on, is patterns and statistics, because this is what he does. He's a mathematician. And, I guess there's something to be said about, mathematicians or pure mathematicians, and are they able to hold their jobs if they come out with information that goes very hard against the system? I was thinking about this the other day, and consider this, that it is, I'm sorry. It's either Oxford, and I think it's Oxford, or Cambridge University, where John Lennox has taught pure mathematics there for decades. John Lennox is an extremely outspoken advocate of biblical veracity and conservative Christianity. I mean, outspoken. He's debated Richard Dawkins and, of course, now it slips my mind, the reporter who died of cancer. I bet half of you know his name, and you're like, oh, this is what his name is. I don't know. Anyways, so on to Section 13.3, the allegedly accelerated destruction of the ancient monuments. The archaeologists of the 20th century have noticed a rather odd tendency. The overwhelming majority of the ancient monuments report deterioration in their condition that allegedly started 200 or 300 years ago, from the moment their study began, in other words, and has become more intense than during the preceding centuries and even millennia. The examples are widely known: the Theater of Epidaurus, Parthenon, the Colosseum, the palaces of Venice, etc. Here's another example in the form of an article from the Izvestia newspaper, 31 October 1981. Quote, "A Sphinx in peril. The famous figure of the El Giza Sphinx in Egypt has stood steadfast for 5 millennia. However, pollution has affected it terribly. A large piece of the sculpture, a paw, has fallen off. The reasons for this are as follows: high humidity, salty ground, and primarily the accumulation of sewage around the Sphinx that isn't filtered in any way at all. It is nevertheless supposed to have stood for 5,000 years without any problems whatsoever. This condition of deterioration is usually explained by the, quote, negative effect of modern industry, unquote. However, as far as we know, there has been no quantitative research conducted to this day as to whether or not modern industry afflicts ancient constructions made of stone. One logically assumes all these buildings to be a lot more recent than what the Scaligian chronology tells us. They are subject to erosion and have a constant natural destruction rate, which is rather high. Okay, that's the end of that brief section. And I got to say this. First off, in my line of work, one thing I have to do is maintenance, and I do remodeling. And I can tell you right now, if you don't maintain structures, and I don't care what they're made of, you have to maintain them, you have to protect them. I don't care if they're steel, I don't care if they're stone, I don't care what they're made of. If you don't maintain them and protect them, they will deteriorate. Nature itself is brutal on built structures of any kind. It's brutal. And some environments more so than others. And I just have to comment on the hypocrisy of getting worried about bad commercial industrial practices because a Sphinx paw falls off. Yet, do we hear about the masses of human beings who are adversely affected or oftentimes killed by these greedy, irresponsible practices? Section 13.4. When did the construction of the Cologne Cathedral really begin? Now, Tiger Doug actually commented on this in possibly his first or maybe second video, which I mirrored on my channel. Nowadays, we are being told that the construction of the famous Cologne Cathedral carried on for several centuries. It is assumed that the construction began in the 4th century. After that, the cathedral has allegedly been rebuilt many times, and nothing remained from the, quote, original cathedrals, unquote, whatsoever. The construction of the Gothic cathedral is supposed to have commenced in 1248. Some sources even mention the exact date as 15 August 1248. It is further assumed that the construction was, quote, finished, for the most part, unquote, by the 16th century, circa 1560. After that, this gigantic medieval cathedral has allegedly undergone minor renovations, but by and large, its shape remained unaltered. And it is gigantic. It's gigantic. Look at it. It's right on the screen there, to the right. It is gigantic, this thing. If the ground was flat all around, it would just, you would see it for miles. And could I comment, speaking of the ground flat, the channel called John McIntyre, who a year or so ago did a video called The Mountain of Evidence, in which he showed proof from the mountains that the earth was more of a plane than a ball. But of course, you could tell he really didn't want to believe that. He just produced another video not long ago where he did some water level tests up in the mountain, and he says that they proved that there would be some sort of curvature and not on a flat plane. I believe that the parameters of that test that he is showing are not controlled, and thus he was getting the results that he was getting. I would suggest anyone go to that channel and check those recent experiments out. That's John McIntyre. Continuing, how valid is the point of view? When was the cathedral that we can see today really constructed? Is the construction that we see truly medieval, dating from the 13th through 16th century for the most part? In figure 1.55, we can see a schematic drawing from a technical brochure. Let me get to that. There we go. It's at the left. That demonstrates which parts of the cathedral are medieval and which ones were built over the last 2 centuries. The full name of the brochure is Gefahr für den Kölner Dom. Bild dazu Mentation zur Verwitterung Auszug aus dem Kölner Dom les und Bilderbuch. Professor D. Arnold Wolf. The Dome of Cologne in Danger. Graphic Documents on Weathering. That's the translation of it. It was originally addressed to professionals specializing in the preservation and restoration of stone constructions. It was printed in Cologne and can be obtained inside the cathedral. According to the scheme, the oldest part of the masonry, that which belongs to the years 1248 through 1560, is represented by horizontal shading, the rest shown by 7 other kinds of shading, such as diagonal, dotted, etc., was constructed a lot later, after 1826! Amazingly enough, the oldest part of the masonry, the horizontal shading, amounts to a small part of the modern edifice. Really, it only covers half the cathedral's foundation, and even this small medieval fragment is not whole, since it consists of 2 parts that are pretty distant from each other. The rest of the masonry, that is, the major part of the entire modern edifice, only appeared in the early 19th century. The absence of masonry dating to 1560 through 1825 is particularly suspicious. Does it mean that there were no works at all conducted in 250 years, or that they did not affect the structure of the cathedral in any way worthy of mentioning? Yeah. Yeah. I'm calling BS on that one myself, because that's just, I'm sorry, that's unheard of. They would have done something with it. Anyways. What German historians and architects are telling us in this manner is that the cathedral that we see today was essentially built in the 19th century! By what criteria does Scaligerian history call it a medieval cathedral in that case? Someone might say that despite the fact that the cathedral was built in the 19th century, it should still faithfully represent the medieval original that has stood there ever since the 13th century. We would like to ask about the groundwork for this hypothesis. Are there any genuine medieval graphical representations of the Cologne Cathedral before the 17th century? Apparently, there are none. The same brochure by Arnold Wolff contains an engraving dated 1834/1836 that depicts the cathedral pretty much the way it is nowadays. The album contains what appears to be the oldest picture of the cathedral on page 21, dating from 1809. We consider all of this to mean that the construction of the cathedral in its present form has only commenced in the 19th century, which is proven by the masonry scheme as shown above. The cathedral was built between 1825 and 1835 for the most part, and the engraving dating from 1834/1836 reflected the final stages of the cathedral's construction. There were renovations done in the 19th through 20th century, but no major changes. There were some traces of an ancient building on the site of the modern cathedral, since some mysterious masonry dating from 1248 through 1560 is present on the scheme. However, this very scheme explicitly tells us that this medieval masonry was used as building material for the 19th century construction. Let us study figure 1.55 yet again. The lower part of the left tower is made of stones dating from the 19th century, laced with layers dating from the 13th through 16th century. The upper part is the tower, is a construction of the 19th century, and the same is true for the other tower. The old medieval building that had stood on the place of the modern cathedral was constructed in the 19th century. Its masonry used as construction material for the new edifice. We would like to pose the following questions to the historians and the archaeologists. 1. Are there any genuine medieval pictures of either the Cologne Cathedral or its predecessor that had existed before the 17th century? 2. Does the modern Cologne Cathedral bear any resemblance to the medieval cathedral that had stood on the same site before the 18th through 19th century? Our hypothesis is that if there has really been a cathedral there, it was significantly different from the modern one, a great deal smaller, for one thing. Point 3. Why are there no traces of masonry dating to the period between 1560 and 1825 in the walls of the modern Cologne Cathedral? Doesn't this mean that the construction really commenced in the 19th century, on the spot that had been previously occupied by a building of smaller proportions dating from the 13th through 16th century? One should also question the reasons for dating the old masonry to the 13th through 16th century. These stones may well belong to the 17th through 18th century. Another enquiry that we find worthy of making concerns the methods used by modern archaeologists for dating masonry fragments. How can they be certain that a given stone was used for the construction of a cathedral wall in the year that they consider to be the correct dating, and not some other. We conclude with a general observation concerning the unnaturally prolonged construction of many historical buildings of medieval Europe. According to Scaligerrian history, they were built very slowly indeed, for centuries on end. The Strasbourg Cathedral is a perfect example. It used to be the tallest building in Europe. We are now being told that its construction began in 1015 and ended as late as 1275. That makes 260 years. The Erwin von Steinbach Tower allegedly took 162 years to build. The historian Kolchrosch makes the logical conclusion that, quote, the entire edifice of the cathedral took 424 years to build. That's almost half a millennium. Kohlrausch also couldn't have missed the unnaturally procrastinated construction of the Cologne Cathedral. Apparently realizing the necessity of explaining such unnaturally extended terms, he offers the following as a theory. Quote, the Cologne Cathedral, whose construction began in 1248 and lasted for 250 years. Such tardiness can be explained by the fact that its stones bear a great amount of artwork. As we are beginning to understand, artwork has got absolutely nothing to do with the matter at hand. It is the erroneous Scaligerrian chronology that has arbitrarily extended the construction period into several centuries. Now we're at the end of that section. I gotta say, concerning this idea that anyone would say something so absurd on its surface, as like such tardiness can be explained by the fact that its stones bear a great amount of artwork. If its stones bear a great amount of artwork, that means that someone designed them that way. Projects like this, because we know that our forefathers weren't stupid. Our forefathers were actually in so many ways smarter than we are because, well, many of them knew a lot of techniques and had a greater amount of understanding of the world around them than we have today because it's been hidden and certain factors have very much tried to destroy these things from our knowledge. This would have been designed. Any of these cathedrals, these beautiful monumental structures, they would have been first designed. I don't go into building anything. I do remodeling and I do some new build. I don't go into anything without meticulous design. Now, could something aesthetic be added in the process or later on? It can happen, but I'll tell you this, especially for things like local records and city records, they would contain the plans of these things. They would contain the plans of these changes. This is very important, these kinds of documents. They're very important. The mere fact that for some reason we don't have them now is highly suspicious. And the way it would have been done is they would have had an expert design this first, and it would have included the aesthetic portions of these structures as well. Okay, this wouldn't be just a haphazard, hey, you know what, my son came up with a great doodle today. I think we should put it on the 15th course of stones. What do you say? That doesn't happen. Not typically, not with projects like these. They are meticulously designed. And furthermore, if they had, Well, okay, so he said it took a long time because of all the art that was involved, right? Okay. So the thing is, the art that was involved shouldn't have ever held up anything. Because if they had enough people at their disposal to build these kinds of structures, then believe me, they also knew the phone number of the artists who would do all of the engravings and etchings, fancy plaster work, woodwork, all of that. Or at least have had their email address, right? These are silly statements to make. Because they can't add up logistically. When you think about the endeavor of building such structures, those kinds of excuses end up going into the pile of horse crap. All right, next section. This one I'm going to love. This is section 13.5. Archaeological methods are most often based on Skeligerian datings. Boy, do I like that title. The modern methods of archaeological dating rely on the Skeligerian chronology to a great extent, and may often lead the researcher to great errors, which are blatantly obvious in some cases. Let us give a few examples. The excavation of a barrow that was, quote, dated with absolute certainty, unquote, to the epoch of Kiev, Russia, the alleged 9th through 12th century, according to the, in quotes, archaeological method, occurred relatively recently. However, 19th century coins were found in the same barrow among the bones. This is mentioned in the article by the Byelorussian historian Zaykovsky, published in 1997 in the 12th issue of the Almanac of History and Archaeology on page 83. It is clear that the coins could not have made their way into the barrow by chance. Is there any explanation? As a matter of fact, there is, and a simple one at that. The ancient barrow belongs to the 19th century. And there is nothing surprising about it, since the pagan church, also known as Romish, had existed in Russia and Byelorussia until the 20th century, complete with specific burial rites. The center of the Romish church had been in the Byelorussian village of Romy, R-O-M-Y. In the 19th century, it had possessed an archbishop, more than 100 parishes, and a special language used by priests in sacraments. There is a 19th century volume containing a detailed description of this old Russian pagan church. I like that. He throws the P word around a lot. That's good. Another example, a different barrow, is being excavated, and the archaeologists make another, quote, perfectly certain dating, unquote, that ascribes it to the Bronze Age. The ground under the barrow had been virgin until the hole that preceded the barrow had been dug. Some 18th century ceramics were found in this hole. It could only have got there during the burial. This is yet another case of archaeologists using, in quotes, scientific methods for the dating of an 18th century mound to the Bronze Age, or the time when the rather inexperienced humanity could not have fathomed the intricacies of iron metallurgy. Okay. But the 18th century was a period when both iron and steel were already known quite well. This barrow only got dated to the Bronze Age since it hadn't contained any steel or iron items. In the cases described, the barrows containing objects that contradicted their initial datings. If there are no such objects, the archaeologists date the barrows, in quotes, scientifically, to times immemorial. The very method of, in quotes, archaeological dating appears extremely flawed and wholly dependent on the a priori known Scaligerian chronology. Section 13.6. One of the numerous problems of the Scaligerian history. The problem of bronze manufacture before the discovery of tin. Okay. Many chemists and metallurgists have been reporting the following peculiar circumstance for quite a while, namely that no bronze could possibly be manufactured in the Scaligerian ancient Bronze Age. Professor Michael Guia, a prominent and versatile specialist in organic synthesis, as well as the chemistry of explosives and plastics, the author of an in-depth work titled The History of Chemistry, writes the following based on his logical construction on Scaligerian chronology. Naturally, in quotes, copper had been known from the prehistoric times not just in its free state, but also as bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. During the prehistoric epoch known as the Bronze Age, bronze was used for the manufacture of various utensils, jewelry, weapons, etc. However, the issue of ancient tin metallurgy remains extremely nebulous. Metallic tin had not been known in the Bronze Age. Nevertheless, it must have been used for the manufacture of bronze. All we can do is assume that a metal of a higher fusibility was manufactured as a result of fusing copper with some materials rich in tin content. Thus, copper was discovered earlier than tin, whose metallurgy is a lot more complex. However, the fact that bronze was discovered earlier than tin does not clarify numerous other problems of ancient history. The picture is perfectly clear. As we can see, the fact that tin metallurgy is more complex than that of copper is common knowledge. Hence, bronze, being a fusion of copper and tin, must have appeared after the discovery of the latter. Scaligerian history has it the other way around. Bronze is supposed to have been discovered before tin in the Bronze Age. This contradiction inherent in Scaligerian chronology can be explained by the fact that the chronologers of that school were neither chemists nor metallurgists. How were they to know that the compilation of a history textbook requires that the description of the discovery of tin should precede that of the invention of bronze? However, the historians of the 17th and 18th century were driven by altogether different considerations, neither caring much for tin nor indeed for science itself. None of them would consider consulting with a chemist. As a result, ancient Greek heroes happily hack at each other with bronze swords that need tin for their manufacture, which had not yet been discovered in that epoch. Modern chemists are naturally confused by such historical tableau and are earnestly questioning the reasons for the existence of such oddities in Scaligerian history of chemistry and metallurgy. I don't think Scaliger and his cadre really knew much about anything other than lying. That's my own opinion. Our explanation is a very simple one. The Bronze Age falls within the epoch of the 14th through 16th century, when tin had already been discovered, after copper, of course. Consider the allegedly ancient bronze idols from Luristan, currently in the Louvre's possession. Michel Guya cites them as examples of ancient bronze art. However, these artful Bronze Age figurines were most probably made in the 15th through 17th century. The same applies to the ancient bronze girandole that has received the dating of 5th century BC, also from the Louvre's collection, that we see in figure 1.57. It may well be an item made in the 16th through 18th century. Here. Okay. And I do want to interject one thing, okay? It's an assumption that what he's saying about bronze and tin. Now, we can have more recent objects made of bronze and tin, let's say, that were dated incorrectly, and they were from more recent eras. But it's a non sequitur to say that maybe because they have incorrectly dated artifacts to a far too distant bygone epoch means that they did not have the knowledge of chemistry and metallurgy in that far distant bygone epoch. It could quite simply mean that they are just misdating items from a more recent epoch, but that the knowledge of how to do these things had existed for a very, very, very long time. Now, section 14. The problems and deficiencies of dendrochronology and several other dating methods. 14.1. The consequent scale of dendrochronological datings does not extend further back in time than the 10th century AD. The dendrochronological method is one of modern dating methods claiming to be capable of dating historical artifacts independently. It is based on the assumption that the yearly growth of tree rings is uneven. Annual ring thickness rates are supposed to be roughly similar for the trees of the same kind that grow in similar conditions. In order to make this method fit for actual dating, one has to construct a reference scale of annual ring thickness for trees of a particular kind for a historical period of sufficient length. An historical period. Let us call this graph of dendrochronological scale. If such a scale is constructed, it might aid one in the attempt of dating archaeological findings containing wooden pieces. One has to determine the timber type, saw off a sample, measure the thickness of rings, build a diagram, and try to find out whether it concurs with any part of the reference scale. One should also consider the question of what deviations of compared diagrams can be ignored safely. However, the European dendrochronological scale only reaches several centuries back in time, which does not allow for the dating of ancient constructions. Many European scientists have started to experiment with the dendrochronological method. However, obtaining results appeared a very complex task. The oldest trees in the European forests are only 300 to 400 years old. Deciduous trees have vaguely defined rings which are hard to study and most reluctant to tell the researcher anything about the past. Quality archaeological material proved extremely scarce against all expectations. American dendrochronology is in better conditions since it is based on Douglas fir, mountain pine, and yellow pine. However, this region is far away from the zone of ancient history, is it? Furthermore, there is always a large number of ignored factors, such as the weather conditions for the period in question, soil quality, humidity level fluctuation for the area in question, its geography, and so on. All of them affect the growth rate of the rings significantly. It is most important that the creation of dendrochronological scales was based on the existing Scaliger chronology. Thus, any alteration of the chronology of documents should automatically alter these scales, whose independence is thus greatly compromised. It appears that the dendrochronological scales for Europe and Asia only reach several centuries back from our age. We shall give a more detailed account of the contemporary state of such scales for Italy, the Balkans, Greece, and Turkey. Let us refer to the diagram of dendrochronological dating scales for those countries that reflects the state of affairs in this area as of spring 1994. This diagram was kindly provided by Professor Y.M. Kabanov of Moscow. He took part in a conference in 1994 where the American professor Peter Ian Kuhnholm made a report on the modern state of dendrochronology, presenting this rather noteworthy diagram that had been compiled in the Malcolm and Carolyn Wiener Laboratory for Aegean and Near Eastern Dendrochronology, Cornell University, Ithaca, New York, USA. In Figure 1.58, we can see fragments of dendrochronological scales for different kinds of timber: oak, box, cedar, pine, juniper, and conifers in general. All of these scales have a very obvious gap around 1000 AD. Thus, none of them can be continued without intervals further back in time than the 10th century. All of the earlier fragments of dendrochronological scales as shown on the diagram cannot be used for independent datings, since their attachment to the time axis is wholly dependent on the Scaliger chronology, which had served as a basis for the dating of several individual ancient pieces of wood. A piece of wood found in a pharaoh's tomb thus gets the dating of some distant millennium before Christ due to, quote, historical considerations, unquote, based on the Scaliger chronology. After that, other ancient pieces of wood are linked to the one that has already been dated. These attempts occasionally succeed, which results in the construction of a fragment of the dendrochronological scale around the first piece of wood. Relative datings of ancient findings within this fragment may be correct. However, their absolute dating, that is the placement of this fragment on the time axis, is wrong. The reason is the first dating was based on the erroneous Scaliger chronology. Let us return to the basics of the dendrochronological methods. In theory, the dendrochronological scale is supposed to grow, beginning with the current period and extending into the past. This implies the collection of ring thickness scales of different specimens. What is the principle of this collation? A modern source, 1055, gives an in-depth analysis. I'm sorry, that was a bibliographical code, not a date, 1055. Gives an in-depth analysis of the problem on page 341. It turns out that the method used is a combination of mathematical statistical methods and visual subjective assessments. Hence, the boundary between dated and undated dendrochronological scales becomes very vague. The book that 1055 that he's referring to tells us rather frankly that if we can find a collation position, you know what? Gosh darn it. We've got to know what he's talking about here. I'm going to the bibliography real quick so I can tell you what book he's quoting from. 1055 is Buck, C.E., and W.G. Gavinaugh and C.D. Litton. It's Bayesian approach to interpreting archaeological data. Series Statistics in Practice, John Wiley and Sons, 1996. Okay, so that's where he's quoting from. Okay, so sorry. This book tells us rather frankly that if we can find a collation position whose diagram concur with those of the traditional chronology to the best of our certainty and knowledge, the new specimen is considered dated. If we fail to discover such a collation position, the specimen remains undated, although even in this case a dendrochronologist can point out one or more collation methods whose concurrence is good but not perfect. Needless to say, the Dendrochronological Society has to agree on what is to be considered a perfect concurrence. Dendrochronology is thus affected by subjectivity and arbitrariness. Different dendrochronological datings have different veracity. The veracity of a dendrochronological dating depends on the certainty of the collations in the dendrochronological scale. Dubious collations cast the shade of ambiguity over the entire scale. The book that he's been referring to, page 341, uses a special term for referring to such datings, namely, quote, the gray zone, with white zone referring to certain datings and the black one to the total absence of datings of any kind. The recently published book by Christian Bloss and Hans Ulrich Niemitz suggests the dendrochronological method to some very sharp criticisms that leave no stone unturned. Section 14.2 Sedimentary Layer Datings, the methods of radium, uranium, and radium-actinium analysis. The Scaligerrian chronology implicitly or explicitly affects the scale graduation of methods, even the rough physical ones supposed to give the absolute age of objects. A. Olinikov tells us that, quote, over the 18th centuries that have passed since the time of the Roman invasion, in brackets in reference to the territory of the modern Savoy, the weathering processes have created a 3 millimeter erosion layer on the walls near the quarry's entrance. Comparing the thickness of this 1800-year-old layer, in brackets according to the Scaligerrian chronology, to the 35-centimeter erosion crust that covers the glacier-polished hills leads one to believe that the Ice Age left these latitudes about 216,000 years ago. The proponents of this method have been well aware of the difficulty of obtaining a referential scale for something like erosion speed. It differs for various climates. The same type of rock erodes at varying speeds in the tropics and beyond the Arctic Circle. Erosion speed also depends on the temperature, humidity, rainfall, and sunshine. This means that every biospheric zone requires the compilation of several scales and diagrams. Besides, one cannot be certain that the weather conditions have remained unaltered since the exposure of the layer that we are interested in. There are many attempts of deducing absolute age by the speed of sedimentary layer formations. They didn't lead anywhere, which is perfectly understandable. Olinikov tells further that, quote, the research in this direction has been conducted by the scientists of many countries. However, the results failed to meet the expectations. It became apparent that similar types of rock erode at different rates, even under similar conditions, and establishing a regular pattern of these processes is hardly possible at all. For instance, ancient documents, in brackets, a reference to the Scaligerrian chronology yet again, tell us that the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II reigned about 3,000 years ago. The buildings that were constructed in his lifetime are now covered by a 3-meter layer of sand. This means that about a meter of sand accumulated every millennium. At the same time, certain areas of Europe have a millenarian rate of 3 centimeters of sediment, whereas for the firths in the south of the Ukraine, this is an annual rate. How do you like that? The development of other methods was attempted as well. Quote, the radium, uranium, and radium actinium methods are valid for the same time interval of 300,000 years. They are convenient for the datings of geological formations when the required precision does not exceed 4 to 10,000 years, unquote. However, this isn't precise enough for the ends of historical chronology and cannot contribute to it in any substantial matter at all. I hope everybody really caught what he's saying there in between the dendrochronological and then the radium, uranium, and radium actinium methods. I did a presentation for a college level science class I was in some years ago. The presentation I did was on radiocarbon dating and how untrustworthy radiocarbon dating is, lest those claiming that they are giving any sort of accurate dates can also provide every possible variable in any given situation, which they typically can't. Even if they were trying to date something, let's say, in the last century, oftentimes they do not have records sufficient enough to provide all accurate variables to determine without any degree of question that those dates that they're providing are accurate. The same thing goes for helium loss in stone. Every one of these so-called scientific and accurate forms of dating rely on them being able to objectively know all variables, which they don't. Furthermore, concerning the dendrochronological problem and wood, I've got a great deal of suspicion concerning everything we've been told about wood and the way wood ages and the way we should see wood today from, say, 1,000 years ago. Now, I would like to see more specimens of wood that we know for a fact are many centuries old, that have been kept in certain various conditions. The reason I say this is, again, it's because I'm a carpenter and I do a lot of remodeling. And for any carpenters out there or who have had to do remodeling on structures where, when they originally had built the structure, they had used species of wood that were more natural to the surrounding lands. You see, a lot of the 2x4s, the framing wood that most carpenters work with now in the U.S. and even around the world, are their fir, their pine, they're those kinds of softwoods, typically, okay? And softwoods is misleading because southern yellow pine is extraordinarily hard. But it's just the way that they rate it. Softwoods have a cone, essentially, and hardwoods don't. That's the way they basically separate species of wood. But if you have done any work on, say, I did some work on a house that was only built, I would say about 40 years maybe or so prior to when I had done the work, and they had used a lot of oak studs to frame this house. These oak studs were about as hard as concrete. They were extraordinarily difficult to work with. I had to pre-drill into them in many cases and screw to them as opposed to nailing, because they wouldn't take a nail. They would just bend your typical 16D framing nail today. So I think about that. Half a century can do that to a lot of woods, as long as they're not exposed to certain factors that can, of course, break down wood, which certain types of bacterial factors that will, degenerate types of woods. In general, if those things are not present, from what I have witnessed, the wood actually continues to harden, solidify, becomes an even better framing member, structural member, and I would imagine aesthetic member of a structure as it ages, as long as it's not exposed to certain kinds of factors that can deteriorate it. Types of moisture and no maintenance and other things that can wear away at wood and deteriorate it. Typically, it's usually moisture and air, and then sun. Everything needs maintenance. But if it's not exposed to those things, not only does it preserve well, but it tends to grow harder and firmer as time goes on. And that's a funny thing. I haven't seen enough samples of wood from 1,000 years ago plus, which I would think there would be, because it's not difficult to maintain pieces of wood in a certain state if you can maintain the environment that the wood is in, which is not as hard to do as you might think. Some areas are actually just naturally good for the preservation of wood and other organic matter. Now the thing is, I've gotten to now section 15, and I'm going to wait there until the next one. But I did want to point something out concerning all that we went through about copper and tin and the Bronze Age. I am just going to point this out. For those of you like me who do trust the historical record of the Holy Bible, I'm going to point something out. In Genesis chapter 4, the lineage of Cain, Q-I-N, Cain, who is called Cain, is given. Now, towards the end of the lineage that's given, we run into this character, Lamech. Lamech has a couple of sons here. He has 2 wives, various sons. It says that his wife, Oda, bare Yibal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. That sounds like Bedouins. Bedouins are common mostly in the Mideast and the northern part of Africa. Now, didn't Cain go far east to the land of wandering? Okay. His brother's name was Eubal. He was the father of all as such handle the harp and organ. I don't know if those are specifically the right instruments. This one here is called Kanur, and this one here, Urgab. Gab would be mound, oftentimes like mound, or shoulders or back. Gab would be used for Gab. That'd be nice. When we get further along in this language project, myself and those who are participating there's just so much that's going to be revealed. Okay, anyways, 422. And Tselah, she also bare Thubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass, which is translated Nashath, and iron, Barzal. Barzal, iron, like Brazil. Anyways, and then they give the sister of Thubal-Cain as being Noma. I'm sure that has to matter. Anyways, this whole lineage doesn't matter whatsoever if every single man, woman, and child were wiped out in the flood, besides for Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives. If that's the case, then this genealogy really just doesn't matter. But anyways, so we have back here, and we could, if we assumed that similar lifespans were being recorded, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. We're not given the lifespans in here. They could have been quicker. These could have been younger sons of sons of sons, you see. But this Thubal-Cain is the instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. So it's my contention that the knowledge of and how to work with brass, iron, and making steel has been around for a long time. Now, do we find steel girders in old structures? I don't know, maybe we do. There are far too many old structures and ancient sites that we could learn a great deal from that are kept from us, kept from independent scientists and researchers, ones that are of the more honest variety. So it's hard to say. But that goes back a long way, eh? And so at 1 hour, 12 minutes, I'm going to wrap this reading and pick up next time with section 15, Are Radiocarbon Datings to be Trusted? Hey, sounds exciting to me, and I think I know where he's going to go with that. So until next time, thank you for joining me, and take care.